Harriet and George's Christmas Treat by Nancy Carlson. It was almost Christmas. Harriet and George were going shopping when they saw Mrs. Hoozit leave the grocery store. "Hi, Mrs. Hoozit," said Harriet. "Well, hi, kids," said Mrs. Hoozit. "No time to talk. I'm off to do my holiday baking. Now be sure to stop over later for a Christmas treat." Mrs. Hoozit rushed away. "Oh no, Mrs. Hoozit is going home to bake," said George. "That can only mean one thing," said Harriet. "Mrs. Hoozit is making fruit cake." "Remember last year when Mrs. Hoozit made us try a piece right in front of her?" said George. "Yuck! It tasted awful," said Harriet. "And I almost broke a tooth." "Remember when you dropped Mrs. Hoozit's fruitcake on your foot?" said Harriet. "Ouch! That really hurt," said George. "But it worked great for cracking nuts," he said. "I'll never forget the time we used the fruitcake to play football," said Harriet. "It almost hit your little brother," said George. "That was a close call," said Harriet. "Wow, fruitcake can be dangerous." "There is only one thing for us to do this Christmas," said Harriet. "Avoid Mrs. Hoozit and her fruitcake," said George. On Monday, when Harriet and George saw Mrs. Hoozit shoveling, they pulled down their hats so she couldn't recognize them. On Tuesday, when Harriet was helping her dad put up the Christmas lights, Mrs. Hoozit looked out her window. So Harriet ducked behind a bush. For the rest of the week, Harriet and George hid from Mrs. Hoozit. They hid behind a snowman. They hid in the toy and bookstore. They hid behind their packages. They hid around the corner of the building. They hid in a tree above the bus stop. And they hid in their fort while Mrs. Hoozit was feeding her birds. By Friday, they were exhausted, but it was worth it to avoid Mrs. Hoozit's fruitcake. On Christmas Eve, they saw Mrs. Hoozit invite Harriet's brother Walt in for a Christmas treat. "Poor little pup," said George. "Soon he'll be eating fruitcake," said Harriet. When Walt finally came out of Mrs. Hoozit's house, Harriet asked, "How was the fruitcake?" "Yummy fudge," said Walt. "Mrs. Hoozit made fudge this year?" said George. Before Walt could answer, Mrs. Hoozit opened the door. "Well, there you two are," she said. "Come in for a Christmas treat." "Okay," said Harriet. "Fudge," whispered George. "I made a big batch of fudge this year," said Mrs. Hoozit. "Oh, boy," said Harriet. "But I could never find you two." and my fudge is all gone. But don't worry, I still have a Christmas treat for you. Last year's fruit cake. Eat it up and Merry Christmas, said Mrs. Who's It. The end.